Thank you, Pramod, and it's a great pleasure to be here at the annual NASSCOM event. I'll talk about services globalization, and I think just try to trace where we are and how it has strategic implications. I think, first of all, globalization is not a particularly new phenomenon. When countries in the West invented sailing ships and navigation tools, they were able to globalize. When these ships became powered by steam engines, you were able to globalize even further with the advent of airplanes and other transportation mechanisms, the telegraph, the telephone. There's been a lot of globalization, which has allowed companies to trade goods, trade products, and start trading other things. What is different today is that we have entered a realm where we are able to trade in services. And this has a lot of very profound implications for us. First of all, the notion was that development for countries was you went from agriculture to industry to services, and therefore it was seen as a natural progression that services was, in a sense, the highest in the pecking order of what people did. And it was also believed that these services, as they became more and more sophisticated, were essentially impregnable to outside competitiveness, and therefore they allowed incomes and productivity to go up. But thanks to the new situation where, thanks to the fact that most of these services that are there are essentially knowledge capital-based services, most of these services are of a nature which can be done on a wire. Given the fact that the entire world is wired, we have a scenario where this historic logic of the fact that services were essentially would lead into higher and higher income productivity, and that they were also going to be impregnable as they became more sophisticated, is no longer true. Because today, if you're really able to create the right kind of human capital and talent in any kind of service in the world, and if it is a service which is essentially fungible or tradable through a telecommunication means, then those services can be performed anywhere in the world. And that's the fundamental, I think, shift that we are seeing, which is that we have entered into an era supported by the fact that more and more of global GDP is services, more and more of global GDP in services is tradable or knowledge services, and technology has now made it possible for these services to be performed anywhere in the world without any particular loss of productivity or capability, has really had a huge impact. And in a sense, what we are seeing today is the impact of this fact that services are now tradable. Now, what does this mean for us as countries, as companies, and as individuals? Now, clearly, this means that this has a huge impact on the way economies will develop, because the fact that you have a young labor pool in India and China, which means that demographics are in your favor, therefore you have a large pool of young talent which can contribute to the global economy. The fact that India and China in 1978 and India in 1991 went through a period of economic reform and liberalization, which allowed them to participate in the global market economy. And the fact that both these countries are investing in developing technological talent has essentially meant, and the fact that more and more of these services are tradable, has essentially meant that the global labor pool for services has gone up. In the sense, the number of people in the world who can actually contribute to the global economy in terms of services has gone up because of these various factors. And it also means that you have these people everywhere and you can access them anywhere. And therefore, it means that over time, there will be the kinds of developments that we see today, where you have, Pramod talked about the whole outsourcing thing in India, where we know that outsourcing in India was just a $50 million business in 1991. It's a $25 or $30 billion business today. We expect that this is going to be a 60, I don't know, whatever Kiran keeps giving numbers, but 60, 70, 80, I don't know what Kiran is saying, but it's going to be, let's say 50, I'd be conservative, so I'll say at least a $50 billion business in India in 2010. Now, it's important to understand this in the context of India's economy. For example, India's total GDP today is about $800 billion. And we can assume that by the turn of the decade, it will be about $1 trillion in size, which means out of $1 trillion economy, approximately about $50 billion is coming from IT and BPO outsourcing services, which means 5% of India's GDP will come from just this one activity. Now, that's pretty remarkable in terms of its impact, because this one industry, which is essentially triggered by technology and the availability of human capital and the fungibility of services, has the ability to go from nothing to 5% of India's GDP. And therefore, you can see that it's going to have a real impact on countries in terms of creating jobs, in terms of creating an economy, in terms of helping in essentially dealing with the global challenges. I mean, just to give you another statistic, if our total software exports and BPO exports are about, say, $25 billion last year, our total remittances, which is Indians working abroad, is about $21 billion, and our total oil bill is about $50 billion. In other words, in some sense, the oil that we use in this country is being paid for by the intellectual capital of our people. And this is a classic example of how resources are being balanced. I mean, physical resources are being compensated by human resources.